In this lesson, I'm going to walk you through an edit from start to finish. Now, this won't cover everything there is to do with editing. It's quite a simple edit, but this should give you a gist for my general approach to editing photos and should help to guide you edit yours in the future. So the first thing to do when editing an image, in my opinion, is to just assess it and see what you want to do with it. So right off the bat, I can tell that I'm happy with the crop as it is. I don't want to change that. The white balance looks okay to me. I can't really see any colour casts that look odd. What I do want to do is obviously bring in some more contrast to the image, add some depth, and I want to add just a little bit more structure to the jackrabbit, especially around its head, its face, and brighten up that eye a little bit so that it pops out a bit more. Before we carry on, you can see if I left click, my mouse cursor will turn red. If I right click, it will turn blue. I normally like to start off in the tone panel just to bring in the right level of contrast. So you can see in my histogram up here, it's well exposed, the shadows aren't clipped and the highlights aren't clipped either, so we've got all the information we could need. I personally like to have at least some black in the image, which will be denoted by this side of the histogram touching the far left, and this little triangle will turn white. So I start by dropping my blacks, and you can see the blue channel has started to clip and become black, and then the cyan, and now there you go, there's some solid black. And if I click this, it's denoted by little blue patches that can be seen over here on the eye, in the pupil, and over there. So that's normally where I like to start. In this instance, I feel I want to just lift the shadows just ever so slightly, and I don't really need to change the tonality here too much. We have everything we want. There isn't actually anything I want to be completely white in this image, which is why I'm not boosting them at all. So the next place I will go here is I want to add a bit of colour back to the image. So I normally do this with the vibrant slider, and this is different to saturation in that vibrant adds more saturation to colours that are currently less saturated, whereas if you just boost the saturation, it increases the saturation evenly all over the image. So if I just drop this off, you can see it becomes really saturated really quickly when compared to vibrance, where it adds it where it's needed mostly. So that's brought back a lot of the colour. I don't often move it that high, but we can fine tune the colour later on. So after that, I'm just going to turn the black indicator off. I will head down to the lens correction. Now, I normally enable the profile corrections, which just gets rid of any vignette and changes the warping so that it's neutral. But looking at this, I actually prefer the vignette staying, so I'm going to remove those profile corrections to the HSL panel. So how it appears to me is that the greens in this image are quite vibrant, they're fine, I like how they look, but the yellows in the grasses could be a little bit stronger for my taste, just to even it out a bit. So I'm going to boost the saturation of the yellows and maybe drop those greens just slightly, only a little bit. So if you press the backslash, you can toggle between the before and after. So that's what it was like before, and this is currently where we're at. The next thing I want to do is actually increase the brightness in this eye. So I'm going to do this with the local adjustment brush. If you click here, and then the exposure is currently up, I'll reset that. And if you just paint it over the eye, you can see the mask overlay here. What I'm actually going to do is increase the whites to brighten it up, and maybe just a tad on the exposure, but not too much. And this can sometimes give it an unnatural appearance, so I normally just drop the blacks ever so slightly to bring it back in, but don't want to crush the blacks. So if I zoom back out on this history panel, if you go back to when the brush was added, you can see a before and after, and that looks a lot better to me. Its eye just pops a little bit more. I think I might actually add a little more to it by going back into the adjustments brush, clicking on the little grey dot, and just boosting the exposure just a little bit more. And there we go, so his eye stands out now. Now this image hasn't needed much editing, to be honest, but I almost always finish off with a bit of dodging and burning in Photoshop to add some more depth to the image. I can do that by right clicking, going to Edit in Adobe Photoshop. Now we're in Photoshop. What I always do is duplicate the background first by hitting Command J. And yeah, as I said, that gives us a duplicate layer of the background. And I'll just rename this one to Burn. And you can find the Burn tool over on the left. Currently it's on the Dodge tool. If you right click and select Burn, and make sure that the range is set to shadows and the exposure is around 4%, maybe less. If you do it too much, it will be a bit heavy-handed. So then I will make the brush size bigger by holding Control and Option, and then left clicking with the mouse, and if you drag it right it will get larger, drag it left it will get smaller, and if you drag it up it will have a hard edge, have a soft edge, sorry, where there's a nice gradient, and if you drag it down it will have a completely hard edge. So I like to use a soft edge for mine so that it looks a bit more natural. I'm just going to add a bit of depth to these shadows by just painting over them. Let's undo that. So then I'll just zoom in to the jackrabbit and just darken a few of the shadows to give them a bit more definition. So if I toggle that on and off, you can see what we've done so far. I actually think I've maybe been a little bit heavy-handed, so if I just reduce the opacity until it looks better. There we go. So immediately you can see there's a bit more depth to the image, and now I'm going to duplicate the background again and then merge this down. And the reason I'm doing that is because the opacity of the layer is only 83%, and I want to make another layer that already has our burning on it so that I can dodge on top of that. So if I then merge this down with the other layer, it will just create a new layer that has all our burning on it, and its opacity is 100%. So I'll rename that burn again. I'll duplicate that with Command J. And then I will rename this to Dodge. Now I can get the Dodge tool over on the left again by right clicking and changing it to Dodge tool. And the areas that I want to emphasize here are especially on the jackrabbit's face. So once again, if you set this now to highlights instead, because we want to be brightening the lighter areas, and keep it on a relatively low exposure, we'll just paint in on these brighter parts on its face. And just on its coat as well. You can see that's just added a bit more punch to the jackrabbit. And yeah, this is before our dodging and burning, and this is after. So if we then go Command S for save, that will send it back to Lightroom. Now the final thing to do is sharpening. So you can do this within Lightroom. By default, it will sharpen the whole image, which can add noise to these areas. So you can see without the sharpening, there's not much noise there, but when I move it up, it makes this horrible grainy appearance. So What we actually want to do is add sharpening, but only to the areas that we want it to be, which will be mainly on the jackrabbit and its face itself. So the way we can remove it from the rest of the photo is by masking. If you hold Option or Alt on Windows and then left click and drag, so the white areas are where sharpening is currently applied, and as we move the masking along, the black areas are where it's been removed from. And we just want the sharpening on the areas that are actually in focus, so that's mainly the jackrabbit's coat, those branches in the background, and around its eye. I think this is around the right spot, and if we zoom in, if I toggle this off, you can see that it's not affecting the area in the background. That's not changing, but the eye, see, there you go, when it's turned off, nothing's affected, and now it's just the jackrabbit's eye. There's also an alternative method for sharpening within Photoshop itself, and this is how I would do it. So I would duplicate another layer and call it Sharpen, and then if you go to Filter at the top, and then we go down to Sharpen, and then Unsharp Mask, and we'll change the focal point to the eye because that's what we want to be looking at. Now, the radius affects how large the lines are that are being sharpened. So when you put it up too high, everything bleeds into each other and it doesn't look great. I normally keep this down, below 3-ish. And the threshold is the same as our masking in Lightroom. So that doesn't need to be too high either, just to remove the sharpening from the areas that are soft. And if we drag our sharpening down, we can see that's currently having no effect, and I just eyeball it basically until it looks about right to me. You've got to be careful not to over sharpen. And that's the sharpening. And then I would just go Command Save and it would send it back to Lightroom again. So here's our before photo and here's our after. In the next lesson, I'll be showing you a very simple way to remove chromatic aberration, and I'll be showing you one of the methods I use to remove color casts.